In this video, you will be introduced to a new technique in vulnerability scanning, something that you haven't seen in the course up until now. We're not going to be using traditional vulnerability scanners such as Nessus or Qualys or OpenVAS. We are, on the other hand, going to be using something called the NMAp scripting engine. And the NMAp scripting engine, or NSE for short, is an engine that is part of NMAp that's used not only for vulnerability scanning, but for doing a lot of other things like password attacks, more advanced enumeration, and so on. In our case though, we're going to be using it to scan for specific particular vulnerabilities, and this is where the NSE shines. But before we jump into that, let me continue with my thought process. So what do we know so far? We started by scanning the IP address, and we found out two pieces of information. The first one is that there's a port that is closed, and that indicates that this port might be protected by a firewall. This is my first key piece of information. And the second key piece of information is an open port, which is port 8080. However, the NMAp scan on that port didn't reveal any version information, so I couldn't figure out what kind of service is running on that port. And this is why we did a manual inspection, which is something that you have to do regardless. No matter what the tools give you as a result, you still need to do some manual investigation yourself. And because we saw an HTTP field in the signature that NMAp returned for us, we were hoping that this is going to be some kind of a web service. So we fired up our web browser, went to port 8080 on the IP address, and we were greeted by a web page. We looked around the web page. It was a very simple one. There wasn't much going on it, except a small image that said powered by struts. So we took note of that, and then we proceeded with the next step of our methodology, which is doing a vulnerability scan. The vulnerability scan revealed that there might be a default Apache Tomcat. We verified this by going to the manager page. However, we were unlucky because the default credentials that usually work did not work this time. So it seems that the system administrator behind the Tomcat manager had changed the default credentials. So our NMAp didn't reveal much, our vulnerability scan didn't reveal much. The only piece of information that we have to go with is the fact that we have a web server with something called struts installed on it. So my initial reaction would be to go and try and find if this struts thing is affected by any kind of vulnerabilities. And luckily for us, as soon as we Google Apache struts vulnerability, we'll find that there's a CVE assigned to it. So it seems like there's been a few vulnerabilities affecting this service. However, of course, as with any vulnerabilities, it affects a specific version. So I want to check if this specific version of struts that is installed on my target is affected by any vulnerability. Now, Nessus, as we know, returned nothing. So I'm going now to go to NMAp, and hopefully I'll be able to find a vulnerability scanning script that will return to me a result saying whether this target is vulnerable or not. Let me show you what I'm talking about when I say a vulnerability scanning script. The NSE, or the NMAp scanning engine, has a whole bunch of scripts that is stored under the user/share/nmap/scripts. You see all of these scripts? All of these are scripts that will scan for vulnerabilities, that will attempt to brute force password, that will take advantage of some misconfigurations, or that will actually investigate some misconfigurations. So what I'd like to do is I want to find out if there's a script that is specific to the CVE that I'm trying to detect, which is CVE 2017-5638. And to do that, I'm going to be using a command that we saw earlier in our course, which is the grep command. So I'm going to be piping out the ls output into grep, and I'm going to be grepping for CVE. And notice here that I removed the dash or the minus after the CVE, because NMAp's naming convention for the scripts has CVE and then immediately the year after. So it will be CVE 2017 and then dash the number. So I made sure to remove the dash after the CVE, and I hit enter. Unfortunately, I get no results returned. And this is because grep by default does not ignore case sensitivity. So right now grep is looking for CVE in uppercase. However, if you noticed, when I was looking at the contents of the scripts directory, all the CVEs were written in lowercase. So I need to do one of two things. Either change CVE to lowercase, or use the -i option, which tells grep to ignore the case. Whether it's uppercase or lowercase, it doesn't matter anymore. So I'll go with the -i option, and here we go. it looks like there's an NSE script that I can use to detect whether this vulnerability exists on my target or not. So let me go ahead and use that. To do that, I do NMAp minus P8080 because now I'm only scanning one port. I do not need to scan the entire port range. And to use the script, I need to do the argument of minus script equal and the name of the script. And then following that, I put the IP address of my target. I'll run the scan, and the result returned says the port is open. However, it doesn't look like the vulnerability was detected. But I'm not going to give up here because I know that these scripts have arguments. So I can specify a lot of options that make the scanning accuracy a lot higher. Right now, I just ran the script on the IP address on port 8080. But if you remember, there was when I clicked on the struts tag or the struts image, it was redirected to a certain URL. So now I'm wondering, do I need to be scanning that specific URL or not? For me to find out, I have to go and understand the script a little bit more and see if I have an option to give it the URL to scan it. So I'll go and Google the script. I'll type NMAp and the name of the script. And I'll read a little bit more about it. And as you can see here, there are certain arguments that I can pass on to the script so that it becomes more accurate in its scanning. And one of these arguments is the URL path. And the default, as you can see in the description, is the root path. So it doesn't take any URL unless I specifically tell it what URL to scan. So let's revisit the URL. I'll go back and click on Powered by Struts, and this is the URL that I am getting redirected to. I'll copy that and I'll go back to the NMAp scan. And now, of course, I need to feed the scan the URL, the correct argument. And to do that, I use the minus scripts minus args to tell the script that I'm going to be introducing an argument to you. But what is the argument? It's the path. So it's path equal, and I'll paste the URL here. So now what I'm doing is I'm being very specific in my scan. I'm scanning on port 8080 only. I'm using the script that scans for the specific vulnerability of CVE 2017-5638. I'm telling the script to scan a specific URL. So let's run that and see what happens. And the result comes back to me with a big, bold, vulnerable saying this is an Apache Struts remote code execution vulnerability that exists on my target. Excellent. So now I know that there's a vulnerability that exists on my target. The next step would be to see if there's an exploit for this vulnerability. If there's a module in Metasploit that I can use to go ahead and take advantage of this vulnerability and exploit it